Hi, everyone. Welcome to Off the Podium. I have Holly Mathieson with me, and she is currently in Scotland, I believe. Welcome to Off the Podium.
Thanks, Tigran. It's nice to see you.
That's a perfect pronunciation of my name. Thank you. So how are you, this is a question I've been asking people. How are you dealing with the current situation? What are you doing? And how are you communicating with your current orchestras and work?
Well, in terms of how I'm dealing with it, I'm just enjoying it, actually. The last 18 months, and I promise this isn't a humble brag, I'd been touring for most of it. So I hadn't had more than 2 weeks at home at a time. And in fact, I think overall I'd been away for sort of 9 months out of the last 12 or something like that. So first thing is that I'm enjoying being at home. I'm enjoying seeing my husband. It turns out we really like each other, which is good. This is the first time we've actually spent time together for more than a couple of weeks at a time since we got married. And I haven't done any study. I haven't done anything related to actually conducting. It's been more about communications and digital projects. So I have an orchestra in Canada, and we've been talking a lot about how does one do something meaningful in this time, because as you will know, every single orchestra and opera company is just flooding Twitter and Instagram with kind of slightly redundant, banal digital material. Mm-hmm. And we thought, well, we don't have, we're a smallish orchestra at Symphony, Nova Scotia. We don't have a massive digital studio. We don't have reams of pre-recorded material of a really high quality. It's just not who we are, and it's not in the budget. So we'd rather not put out less high quality stuff in some kind of competition with these bigger outfits. We'd rather just do something that's worthwhile for the people who support our concerts. So we're concentrating on education. My husband and I co-artistic directed the Nevis Ensemble, which is a street orchestra. And we're used to making music in completely stupid situations of, well, what would we normally do when, the whole premise of the thing is music for everyone, everywhere. So we've made it about, well, who doesn't have access to the internet and can't see all of the streaming that's going on? Let's make something for them. Or who isn't part of a choir, or whose little string quartet they normally play in, they're too elderly and they don't know how to work Zoom. What can we do to make something that they can participate in? So it's been more about that sort of thing, a little bit more outreachy. Yeah. And the rest of the time I just try and avoid watching too much of what's being produced, because after a while it just all gets a bit numb and blurred into one big orgasm of music making that I'm not sure it's actually adding a great deal of value. That sounds awful.
Yeah, it's really interesting you said that. The past couple of guests I've had similar thoughts to what you just said. I had Jaime Martin, who's a conductor. He was on my podcast. And I also had Vijay Iyer, who's a jazz pianist, composer. He was on. And you all share some similar thoughts about this. And it's really interesting to hear these things from different musicians from different parts of the world. And it's tough. And I don't know what could be done to make it better. And I do have a fear for orchestral music, for classical music and jazz as well, that if this doesn't end soon, it's going to really have a big negative impact for the musical world. It's scary. It's scary because I said this a couple of times now that, entertainment and sports organizations and sports teams will survive, I think, much better than we will, because I think they'll be on TV. And of course, it's not the same not having the 20,000 people cheering you on, but I still think they'll get big deals, to broadcast their stuff through various platforms, and they'll still make a living and entertain people. It's a bit different in the music world. What do you think? I mean, I know there's a lot of negatives. What do you feel like is a positive outcome after all of this ends? And is there a positive thing after all of this ends?
I think there will be at least one positive thing, simply because humans seem to insist on making it so. That's why we still exist against many odds. I think already I'm seeing a lovely outcome, and it's something Jon and I have talked about a lot, is that one thing that's shifted in the content that's coming out, and we've noticed it not just in music, but in the dance world and the theatre world, and also the visual arts world, the stuff that's coming out during this time, is that it's a shift away from the product of this is our performance, we're brilliant at what we do, to here's a video of me this morning in my kitchen practicing. Here's me trying something that I haven't tried before, or I haven't done ballet for 3 days, so I don't know how this is going to go, but here's me trying a triple pirouette. And there's something really nice and human, and it's getting back to the arts being about an endeavor rather than a product that can be sold or commodified or kind of held up as being some godlike thing. It's not. It's just humans muddling through and practicing and being good and being bad and trying harder. And I think that's been a really nice aspect of some of the stuff that's started happening online. And I think from a practical point of view, it's forced everyone other than the Met, the Berlin Phil, and Wiener Staatsoper to go, oh my goodness, we need to wake up and join the 21st century. Streaming and high-level audio and video is essential.
Yeah.
And I hope also that it will lead to a little bit more sophistication in marketing and comms departments in the way they do that. And it's nice to see that, you know, you do see some slightly tacky things coming out, but I think more and more artists and music directors are getting involved and saying, no, that is not high quality. I would rather we do just one thing, but make it meaningful than 10 clickable 30-second joke videos of people playing trombone in the bath or something. Yeah. So hopefully there'll be a shift a little bit in the sophistication.
You know, going back and thinking about what you're doing now, probably thinking about some programming maybe, or maybe not, but a lot of what you've done, reaching out to audiences and people who might not have music, makes me think about programming. And what do you do when you program? I mean, people talk about diversity, but in programming, how do you approach just programming a concert, and maybe also a bigger lens into programming a season? What do you consider? With some orchestras, you don't have a big budget, so you can't commission too many composers. With some orchestras, you don't have a big budget, so you can't rent too many pieces that are not, you know, in your orchestra library. So how do you approach programming?
Well, philosophically, I suppose I approach it that I want to make it something that I would be interested to go and see, and with a kind of a question in mind. Like, you know, I think we always just assume that there's an overture, a concerto, and a symphony, and that's our meat and vegetables. And I suppose I just always try and question that. I think a lot of us do, of why do we do that? Why does there have to be an interval? Why can we not just do a straight hour concert with some incredibly high content, you know, really interesting ideas motivated work, and then all go home or have dinner after the concert or something, you know? And I know there are a million financial implications in terms of what people can charge for tickets for a slightly shorter concert. But again, I do wonder if those sorts of things will become a little bit more attractive to an audience, actually, just to come to watch one perfect nugget of art and then disappear, rather than making a whole night of it. I mean, like everyone, I have a deep and ardent wish to get as many people of color and women and people who are not in fully able bodies to get their, not just their music into the concert hall, but also to get performing themselves. And I know I'm certainly not unique in that. And one of the challenges I think we face with that is that often that repertoire is much harder to access in terms of getting a chance to hear it before you program it. You have to take a far bigger gamble on it. But also it's often really expensive. Like if you look at something like the music of Louise Farrenc, which I really love, and you know, it's not like she's an avant, you know, she's a 19th century composer. It costs a bomb to put on, and it's so frustrating. It's the same with a lot of 20th and 21st century composers. You pay through the nose to get that on there. And it's a real disincentive, I think, for smaller organizations to program courageously or diversely. But I think I try as much as I can to use, I can't remember the name of it now, but there's that incredible database. Is it called the Diversity Project?
Oh,
it's an
yes.
amazing,
Okay. Yeah.
incredible website, and really broadly diverse and celebratory of all sorts of people. And I try and go to that a lot. And I'm lucky in Canada that my boss there, Chris, the CEO, is absolutely on the same wavelength with all of that. For the Nevis Ensemble, it's much easier really, because no one pays for tickets. We could play absolutely anything at people and they have no say in it. I mean, we for a tour, say a 2-week tour in summer, we will do about 70 concerts, 70 in 2 weeks, about 7 or 8 gigs a day. And we'll have a pad full of about 30 pieces of music. And it's a mix of classical, pop, jazz, traditional Scots, fiddling, all sorts. And also a fifth arm, which is new commissions and new music. And the players program each concert separately, and we sort of keep an eye on it, but really it's up to them what they want to play. And Jon and I swap as conductor piece to piece, depending on what we want to be doing. So it sort of diffuses the energy away from us and onto the players. But that first selection of 30 pieces is up to us. And always we have this thing in mind of, well, how do we get away from Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms? And once you've just made a decision to, then actually philosophically it's not hard, but it's the practical things. You know, since we're on the road, we have a 40-piece standard double wind, double horns, double trumpets. The only addition is that we have a kit player as standard. One of the basses can always play electric bass, and we have 2 saxes who can also double as third and fourth horn transposed. So some music that's absolutely perfectly set up for, but say if you're wanting to do works by composers from the African diaspora, often anything that's written in the last 50 years will have tuned percussion, which we can't carry with us because we're climbing up mountains and running into old folks' homes. And anything that's older, stuff that fits within that orchestration pre-20th century, often it will be much, much older and requires continuo or lute or theorbo, you know, all these sorts of things that we just don't have. So it's very, very limiting. And as a result, often we will actually approach composers directly and say, is there any chance you can reorchestrate this piece you've done to fit what we're doing? That's for men and women and all ethnicities. We'll just say, we really love this piece, we love what you do, we can't do it in our current state, so can you help us out? And most people actually would rather get their music played than be precious about it, so they'll often make the changes. But those are the I don't know if that answers your question really, I'm just blithering, but
it's great.
It's finding that way of balancing your philosophy about programming with what's possible. And I think it can't be fixed immediately overnight. The same thing as, say, diversity in conducting. It can't be fixed overnight. It takes so long to train conductors. It takes so long to change the marketing and the financial systems. And, you know, it just takes time, and we have to be patient. But I think if we all approach it with the right philosophy, the right mindset, it does shift.
Well, since you brought it up, diversity in conducting, I want to hear your thoughts. I mean, how is the world doing with that? How is your 2 countries doing? Because you were born and raised in New Zealand, from what I understand, and now you live in Scotland and the UK. You worked all over. How are those 2 countries doing? How is the world doing? I mean, are there we see that there are more women conductors, but what's the potential? What are you seeing? And just your thoughts on it.
It's really interesting, actually. I was one of the Taki Concordia fellowship winners, Mara and Allsop's amazing program that's been running about 10 years now. And we're currently meeting every Friday. We have a Zoom, all like 30 of us get together and have guest speakers and things and catch up with each other, which is really precious stuff to be doing. And yet again, Marin's kind of hosting and being incredibly generous with her time and connections and knowledge. And we talk about it a lot. I mean, I think here in the UK, it's shifted so hugely. I mean, for gender, that is, everyone is hungry for women to be conducting. And I think there are a lot of young women getting promoted and getting work that they're not ready for over and above men actually at the moment, because marketing departments are so desperate and hungry to show that they're really willing to make a change. And I think it's well meant. I don't think it's paying lip service. I think people have just had the scales lifted from their eyes and have gone, oh my goodness, you're right, this is insane. But I think perhaps it's just every now and then I see someone who's being thrown into an A-list orchestra, and I think, you poor thing, you're just being set up to be in trouble, really, to flounder. You're not ready. You need to, but I suppose people will sink or swim. What concerns me is more that with diversity in terms of gender, but the far greater issues of like ethnicity and stuff, because that's a bigger nut to crack, I think, is this thing that it's all very well to hire people to fill these slots, but if the general practice of what we're doing is still 19th century white male, that's not diversity. It's if you're going to get diverse people in to do this work, then the real value is in letting them do it in a diverse way and bring their culture and their experience and their personalities. And so I do look at it a little bit and think, yeah, we're ticking some boxes, but not a lot is changing in terms of diversity of attitude and diversity of practice. And I think that's the next step, I suppose.
Yeah, so you've had a successful career, but your start, which I found out, was a little bit interesting, because I did see that you had some work as an orchestra librarian.
yeah, it's a really good first job, actually.
It's awesome because and I've done some orchestra library work. It's really a good way. First off, it's just good way to learn repertoire and learn about pieces. Sometimes you're going through these shelves and you find things, you're like, wow, I didn't even know that composer or that piece existed. And that's a good thing to do. But also just to know what it takes to prepare before even getting on stage, before the first rehearsal. Some of your experiences, maybe a funny story that was terrifying at the moment, but now looking back at it is funny, if there is anything, or just your thoughts on that job.
A lot of it was terrifying. I had no idea what I was doing. I don't know how I got the job, but it was for the Philharmonia, so tiny budget, because of course it's a London orchestra. They have no money. They're working every week of the year, 2 or 3 concerts at least a week. And with the time I got it, it was just the one librarian doing the whole job. I think they have 1.5 now. So it was exhausting. The things I loved most about it were the connections you make with the players. You get to know them as mates. And if someone's having a bad day, they'll come down to the library and have a cry and a cuddle and let you sort of become an agony aunt down the library, and there's always a bottle of wine somewhere that can be opened if needs be. And likewise, you get a really nice relationship with the conductors, because you're the one person on the management team that doesn't need to sell them. I'm not hiring you. I don't need to think you're good at your job. You don't need to prove to me you're a genius. Just tell me whether it's a G natural or a G sharp in bar 57. That's our conversation. And I think actually a lot of the really massive conductors quite enjoy that. You'd see one of the proper managers would come in and they'd be very formal and it would all be a little bit contrived, and then they'd leave and they'd just turn around and go, oh, I really screwed up the third movement last night, didn't I? What did I do wrong? And it'd be so down to earth, and no maestroing and all of that ego stuff, just two colleagues discussing a very practical thing and having a good laugh. And, you know, I really loved that aspect of it, but not least because it means you stop thinking of these people as gods. You know, if you're watching an orchestra tour, and I think it's different watching from the management than it is from playing in an orchestra. You have a different perspective of it. But say doing the Mahler tour with Marzel, who I loved, by the way. He was so much fun. He was such a good dude. Cheeky, really cheeky, but so much fun to hang out with. And, you know, we did all the Mahler symphonies. He had good days and he had bad days, and sometimes, and then the next night he'd have an absolute blinder and you'd be reminded, but none of it mattered. It didn't make him a bad conductor that he'd have a bad night. It didn't make him a bad musician. It didn't ruin the orchestra. It didn't ruin the concert. You sort of saw the ebbs and flow of it and the reality of it and how varied it is and how real it is, actually. Yeah. It stopped me from idealizing these people.
Yeah.
But in terms of bad, sorry.
What
were you going to say?
No, go for it.
I was just going to, in terms of bad experiences, my goodness, I was screamed at by some opera conductors for, say, these big opera galas where you've got one rehearsal and then the gig that night, which is very London, and it's 20 different arias, and someone's agent has sent the wrong keys. So an aria's turned up, the orchestra starts playing the wrong key, the singer can't sing it, and you know the photocopy is broken, and it's a strike in London and it's pouring with rain, so there's no public transport to get another one sent, and there's a conductor screaming at you. It was horrendous. My alcohol consumption definitely went up when I did that job. And I'm sure a lot of those mistakes were my fault as well. There was a great moment with Tugan Sokiev, who's one of my all-time favorite conductors. I just think he's superb, such a gentleman, beautiful technique, incredibly respectful to the orchestra always. And we were doing quite a sort of obscure Prokofiev piece, you know, not something you have on the shelves. It's something you get in specially. And we were going on tour the next day, so we had 2 music boxes on the go, and I'd accidentally put his score in the one to go on the flight that night, but we had a rehearsal in London the next morning, and we got there, the players had their parts, but his score was gone, and of course we didn't have a spare. It was this obscure piece. So I called or emailed every music librarian in London and was like, does anyone have this piece? No one did. And I had to sprint down to Henry Wood Hall, which had down in the crypt has the libraries of RPO, the Philharmonia, you know. And we were just in some back cupboard throwing scores out from like the 1920s to try and find one. And we found this obscure old Russian copy of it, totally tattered and weather beaten. I sprint out. There was a strike, so there was no public transport. It was pouring with rain. There were no taxis available. I had to run back to the South Bank Centre. All of this happened within an hour. Got there, put the score down at 1 minute past rehearsal starting. And he looked at it, and he looked at me, and I was nearly in tears. I was so embarrassed, and it was the most dreadful edition. And he looked at me and he just smiled and he said, "This is my favorite edition of this piece. Thank you." I could have kissed him. I don't think he would have enjoyed it much. It's not his cup of tea, but my goodness, what a gentleman. Wow.
That's amazing. And you did say something about, Mazel and how sometimes things are not perfect. Sometimes things are just the way they are, and these are things that athletes and other entertainers, people in other fields go through daily, and they're on TV or somewhere in public, and people see these things. But in music, somehow we just always want to be perfect in classical music, and it's terrifying. And I think it's not a good thing. I think it's okay to be okay or not perfect that night and still be out there and people see you, and then you come back the next day and you're better. Just like with the athletes, some days you score a couple of goals, other times you're just terrible. It's okay, it happens. So hopefully this thing, everything happening, people will broadcast things more. And I talked to a couple of administrators recently on my podcast, and in the US, I don't know how it is in Europe, but in the US there's a lot of union rules and regulations about broadcasting video and other things, and hopefully that will change. And I just want classical music to be everywhere, and I want jazz to be everywhere, and I just, it's not as in people's lives as I would like it to be, you know. And sometimes we get carried away as musicians and we stay in our own bubbles, and we think that people actually, you know, we say Stravinsky and we think everyone knows Stravinsky, where I have many family members and friends who are not musicians and might not know Stravinsky. They'll probably know Beethoven and Mozart, obviously, but they don't even know Stravinsky. And that, for us as musicians, that's like one of the giants of classical music. So I just hopefully it'll be out there more and more. Okay, well, one of my favorite questions for you is a life-changing moment, and this could be a personal life-changing moment or a musical life-changing moment, or one of each.
Well, that's tough. Gosh, I'm gonna have to think about that.
Okay, no worries. Let's maybe
Yeah, come back to it.
We'll come back to it later. No, if we were to open your phone or your computer, whatever you use to listen to music, what are some of the last tracks? You know, songs or pieces. It doesn't have to be classical music.
I've been obsessed with Schrecker and Korngold for quite a while. So I've been listening to some of Schrecker's operas. Die Gezeichneten, my gosh, it is so lush. I love it. And Korngold's Symphony in F sharp. I've done that once before with an amateur orchestra, and I really want to do it again. So I've been listening to it to think, right, who can I pitch this to? Because it's such a good piece. Yeah. All of that kind of turn of the century Viennese stuff really interests me. What else? Well, today we've been listening to the Nevis Ensemble has made a video with amateur players from all over the world, have sent in versions of them playing great Scottish pop song 500 Miles, and we've edited it all into a video. So we've had that on repeat today. And I've been revisiting all the kind of pop music I listened to in the 90s when I was in high school and undergrad at uni. Like Portishead, Radiohead, Prodigy. It was great music back then. I don't know if it's just old age or middle age, but I listen to sort of top 40 hits at the moment and think, but this is just crap compared to the complexity and depth of thought that went into like one of Radiohead's albums. I mean, OK Computer, it was groundbreaking. It's incredible music, and it still stands the test of time as being superior to pretty much everything that's come since. So I've sort of been going back and listening to it again and appreciating it again for what great craft a lot of those songwriters had. Yeah.
So another question is working with young musicians. I know you're passionate about that. And, you know, musicians, and I hope, I know people who are not musicians listen to this, including my brother, who's one of my biggest fans, obviously, and he's not a musician. But why is it important to have music education, and the importance of youth orchestras? Because you worked with youth orchestras. People think of it as, you know, sometimes associate that with, okay, we're training these people to be musicians, but and I know you don't feel that way. That's not the only way you feel about this, because I've heard other things that you've talked about. So some of your thoughts about youth music and youth orchestras and music education.
I think the big thing about getting music into young people's lives, and even older people's lives, is it gives a set of experiences. I won't even say skills, but experiences and interactions that are kind of unmatchable anywhere else. You know, sport is a tremendous thing for kids to do for similar reasons, but it has at its heart competition. And music making, unless it's contrived to be a competition, doesn't. It's just about cooperation and listening and being mindful and leaning in to help the people either side of you and making sure you're not too loud, otherwise it ruins it for someone else. These are incredible life skills that at the moment, especially with popular culture, you just don't get anywhere else. I mean, it's like the antithesis of Instagram. So I think for me, that's the value of it. And it's a slow skill. It's a slow developing skill. It's long-term activity. The longer you spend doing it, the more enjoyable it becomes, because you develop greater facility. Whether or not you get good at it or sound good, or that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's I don't know, it's the equivalent of vegetable gardening being so satisfying, because it takes time and it's not immediate, and you have to water it and you have to watch it, and then when you finally do see your first potatoes coming up, it's a far more profound sense of achievement, and in the process you've learned about physics and biology and all of these other things. So for me, that's what music is for kids. It's a set of experiences and skills that I don't think they really get anywhere else.
Yeah. Well, something your fans or people who follow your career don't know about you that you're willing to share with us.
Oh, that's reasonably well known. I have a dairy allergy. I can't eat cow's milk.
Oh, wow.
Other than that, I'm very dull, I have to say.
Yeah. And another thing that I came across and read very little about, apparently you're a dancer, you were a dancer, a little bit about that and how that has influenced your conducting, because I know, I think if I'm not mistaken, this is the reason why sometimes, and we talked about Moselle and how, we're not perfect at all times. I can't remember if this is true or not, but I think Carlos Kleiber's second wife was a ballet dancer.
Ah, interesting.
And I remember talking to a conductor, and he's like, oh, you should watch his stuff pre that, and then after that a lot of his gestures changed. So I think I remember reading something, and also that was confirmed later. But how has dance helped your conducting?
That's fascinating. Yeah, so ballet was my number one love, and that was actually what I wanted to do right up until my late teens, and it was just injuries and various other things that kind of put an end to it. So I was a little bit disgruntled when I had to start my music degree, because it wasn't what I wanted to be doing. But in terms of how it helps, well, first of all, how it doesn't help is that often it means your energy is too high. So you have too much energy up in your rib cage for it somehow with it. You're lifted too much. So you have to learn to get a bit more yoga and lower your energy back down a bit. But in terms of how it helps, gosh, first of all, I would say that acute awareness of tiny micro movements and isolations of particular where your elbow is in relation to your shoulder. I mean, you just know that sort of stuff without having to look in a mirror, because you know the feeling of analyzing your anatomy that minutely. So in terms of fixing things in your technique, it helps, definitely. Also, I think there's something about dance that teaches you something about the carriage of line somehow, that the flow of a musical phrase or musical line, because the human body never stops moving. There's always a sense of, is my right hand accelerating towards the outside of my body, or does it hit resistance as it goes out? There's always a sense of the speed of line through time and space. But there's definitely something analogous to that, and what your body does in terms of energy and flow and time and space to melody and phrase, I think.
Yeah. Well, speaking of PhD, your PhD is quite interesting. Why don't you say a little bit about your PhD work?
It had really pretty pictures in it. That is the most interesting thing about it. And it's now like a doorstop. But it was about, well, it was music iconography. So it's a mixture of music history and art history. And I looked at, in particular, at 3 conductors who worked in London in the long 19th century. A guy called Louis Julien, who actually did the first prom concerts in London, although no one talks about him because he was a funny little Frenchman. And then Hans Richter, who was the first big Wagnerian conductor here, and Henry Wood, who became known as this quintessentially English or British conductor, but that wasn't at all how he marketed himself in the first part of his career. He was, we think of them as this kind of folk hero, but he was really dastardly. He, like in his autobiography, he wrote out his second wife and 2 daughters. He just pretended they didn't exist because they didn't fit with Canny about his public image, and he was very modern in that way. And people have sort of swallowed it hook, line and sinker. But all of the images that we see of him, these kind of really iconic images, they were very carefully staged and manipulated, and he knew exactly what he was doing in that regard, I think.
Anything in New Zealand?
Oh, I would just like to be able to work more in New Zealand. Apart from 1 or 2 organisations, they're just not that interested in hiring New Zealanders. So we just don't get to go there very often, any of the New Zealand conductors who are working overseas. And
the amazing thing about New Zealand, it's relatively, compared to obviously the bigger countries, it's sort of a small country, but there's a lot of music happening, a lot of amazing musicians coming out of New Zealand. I've had the pleasure of having a couple of them on my podcast. So,
oh, cool.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a great place. I've never been there. Hopefully I'll visit one of these days.
Especially the opera singers coming out. For some reason, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands just produce the most phenomenal voices. Wow. That's our biggest trade in classical music, I think. Oh, and I worked out what my life-changing moment was.
Okay.
And I think it was probably the first day I started work at the Philharmonia as the librarian. It was just like all of a sudden the horizon went from this far away from my face to light years away in terms of my awareness of what was possible and what happened in the big wide world. It was extraordinary.
Well, great. Holly, anything else you want to add?
I don't think so.
Thank you so much for joining me. Holly Mathieson was my guest, conductor, currently living in Scotland. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Tigran.